The morning sun glittered on the still waters of Lake Pinecrest, where Marcus Hill stood barefoot on the old wooden dock, coffee steaming gently in his hand, the air filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. And as he looked at the little red cabin behind him, weathered but sturdy, he felt the same wave of gratitude he always did when he came here, because this wasn't just a vacation home or a piece of property. It was a place his late father had built with his own hands decades earlier, the place where Marcus had learned to fish, to chop wood, to sit with family around the fire on summer nights while cicadas sang in the trees. And even though his busy life in the city often pulled him away, this cabin was his anchor, his reminder of roots, of heritage, of everything worth protecting. He spent the early hours mending a loose shutter, whistling softly, unaware that forces greater than a squeaky hinge were moving against him, forces dressed not in the honesty of labor but in the polished arrogance of paperwork and titles, because while Marcus saw a family legacy in this cabin, Evelyn Parker, the head of the Homeowners Association, saw nothing more than another opportunity to flex power and feed her ego. The HOA had long been notorious among the residents for enforcing rules unevenly, for targeting those who didn't bow down, for issuing fines to lawns not mowed properly, or paint colors not approved by the board, and while most people grumbled in silence and paid whatever was demanded, Marcus wasn't the type to be bullied, especially when he had the receipts to prove every so-called fee had been paid in full. Yet when the first letter arrived claiming he owed $2,300 in back dues, he chuckled at the absurdity, thinking it a clerical error that could be quickly corrected. But his attempt at reason was met with Evelyn's thin smile and icy dismissal, her voice dripping with disdain as she warned him that non-compliance comes with consequences, words that lingered long after she shut the door in his face, though Marcus, calm by nature, still believed that reason would win, that the truth would prevail until more letters arrived, harsher and bolder, threatening liens, penalties, even seizure, and the neighbors, some sympathetic, others avoiding eye contact, whisper about how the HOA had ruined lives before, how Evelyn enjoyed making examples out of those who resisted. And though Marcus's jaw tightened, he refused to show fear, for this cabin was not just wood and nails, it was blood, memory, love. It never once crossed his mind that they would dare go as far as demolition, not until the day he returned from a short business trip to find bulldozers in his yard. The roof caved in, walls splintered, the home his father built reduced to a pile of broken beams and shattered glass, with Evelyn herself standing smugly in front of the rubble, clipboard in hand, reciting unpaid fees, as if the destruction of his heritage was no more than an item checked off a list. And though neighbors watched from a distance, horrified but silent, Marcus said nothing. Not yet. For while Evelyn mistook his silence for defeat, she didn't know who Marcus's family was, nor the storm of justice that was about to descend upon her carefully crafted empire fear. And as he picked up a splinter of wood from the ruins, holding it in his hand like a fragment of his father's legacy, his phone was already in the other, dialing a number that would soon change everything, because this story was not going to end with rubble, but with the powerful lesson that those who abuse authority often forget. The law always remembers, and family always protects its own. "We followed procedure," she said curtly when Marcus demanded to know how this was legal, waving the stack of papers clipped tightly in her hands, though he could see her fingers gripping the board a little too tightly, betraying her awareness that she had gone too far. Evelyn thrived on intimidation, on the silence of neighbors who dared not cross her, and she thought Marcus would be no exception. Marcus calmly reached into his bag and pulled out a neatly organized folder, receipt staple. Later that evening, Marcus drove into town to speak with residents who had lived under the HOA's thumb for years. The story spilled out. Families fined for lawn chairs, single mothers threatened with liens, elderly couples bullied into selling their homes for pennies after unpaid fees mysteriously multiplied beyond their means. And though some spoke in whispers, others broke down in tears, admitting they wanted to fight, but didn't have the money, the time, or the courage to challenge evilly. She controls everything. Marcus allowed himself a small, measured smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes, but carried the weight of unshakable certainty, replying, "She thinks she controls everything. She doesn't know who my family is." Words that sent a ripple of curiosity and cautious hope to the room. Days turned into weeks as Marcus gathered every shred of evidence, not only his own innocence, but the HOA's long trail of corruption, his calls to his siblings, spread across federal agencies, becoming more frequent, more detailed, though he spoke in coded language, never revealing to Evelyn or her allies that the Hill family tree was rooted deeply in federal law enforcement and justice, that while she wielded local ordinances and intimidation, he had access to statutes, investigators, and prosecutorial firepower that dwarfed her clipboard and gavel. Meanwhile, Evelyn grew bolder, strutting through neighborhood meetings with the air of a monarch, bragging about setting an example with Marcus's cabin, dismissing murmurs of unease from even her own board members, telling anyone who raised concerns that the matter is closed and the law is on our side, blind to the quiet storm brewing just outside her field of vision. Neighbors began slipping Marcus files, old letters, photographs of unauthorized demolitions, whispers of misused HOA funds. And though Evelyn still believed she had silenced resistance, she didn't notice how many eyes were beginning to glance nervously her way. How many residents were starting to speak Marcus's name, not with pity, but with admiration. For his silence was no longer seen as defeat, but as discipline, the kind of silence that precedes thunder. When Evelyn finally attempted her boldest move, filing a lien against Marcus's land in hopes of seizing outright, Marcus didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't beg. He simply made another phone call, his voice steady as he said, "It's time." And on the other end of the line, his brother's calm reply carried the promise of reckoning, a promise that the next time Evelyn and her allies tried to flaunt their authority, they would not be facing a lone homeowner with receipts, but an entire family armed with federal law, truth, and the authority she had always pretended to wield but never truly possessed. The day of the HOA's monthly board meeting arrived, and Evelyn Parker strode into the community hall with the same arrogance that had defined her reign for years, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor, clipboard tucked under her arm, chin tilted high as the room itself bowed to her authority. But what she failed to notice was a strange tension humming among the residents. The way eyes darted toward the back of the room where Marcus sat quietly, hands folded, his calm demeanor masking the storm about to break. The meeting began as usual, Evelyn calling the room to order, rattling off agenda points with clipped efficiency. And when she reached the topic of Marcus Hill's delinquency, she paused dramatically, as though relishing the moment, announcing loudly that his property had been lawfully seized and demolished, a statement meant to draw murmurs of approval, but instead earning only uneasy silence, broken at last by Marcus's voice, low but steady, carrying through the hall with surprising weight. "Are you sure it was lawful, Ms. Parker?" A simple question that made her flinch ever so slightly before she sneered. Of course it was, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. But before she could continue, the sound of heavy doors opening at the back of the hall made every head turn. Unmarked black SUVs had pulled up outside, and now, one by one, men and women in dark suits entered, their presence commanding and unmistakable, badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. FBI, DOJ, Homeland Security, and leading them was Marcus's brother, Special Agent David Hill, followed by his cousin Renee, a federal prosecutor, and his sister Angela, an investigator with Homeland Security. Each of them radiating the quiet authority of those who don't need to raise their voices to be obeyed. Gasps rippled through the hall as Evelyn's confident posture faltered, her hand gripping the clipboard so tightly her knuckles whitened, her voice catching in her throat as she stammered, "What is this?" But David stepped forward, his badge held high, his voice clear and unwavering as he declared, "This homeowners association is under federal investigation for fraud, abuse of authority, and unlawful demolition of private property." And the hall erupted in shocked whispers, neighbors leaning forward, some with relief, others with disbelief, while board members shifted nervously in their seats, sweat beading at their temples. Evelyn attempted to regain control, her voice rising shrill and unsteady as she protested, "This is outrageous. We were just enforcing the rules." But Renee stepped in, her eyes cold, placing a thick file on the table in front of Evelyn, a file brimming with evidence collected from residents, bank records, and Marcus's meticulous documentation. And with each page flipped open, Evelyn's face drained of color as her misdeeds were laid bare. Misappropriation of funds, illegal threats, forged demolition orders, all neatly cataloged, undeniable and damning. Neighbors who once sat silent now found their courage, voices rising in support of Marcus, recounting their own stories of harassment, their own evidence, their testimonies weaving together into a chorus of truth too powerful to be ignored. And as the federal agents began seizing documents, computers, and financial ledgers, Evelyn's clipboard slipped from her trembling hands, clattering to the floor like the final symbol of her collapsing authority. Marcus, still seated calmly, watched the scene unfold with the same quiet dignity he had carried since the first letter arrived. And when Evelyn finally turned to him, eyes wide with panic, sputtering, You planned this," he simply replied. "No, Evelyn." As the board members were escorted out, handcuffed and pale, the residents sat in stunned silence, some whispering prayers of thanks, others openly weeping with relief, realizing that the tyranny they had endured for years was crumbling before their eyes. Evelyn, once the queen of the HOA, was now just another defendant facing the full weight of federal law. Her empire feared dismantled in a single night, leaving behind not the echo of her commands, but the community hall, once ruled by fear and silence, now buzzed with the electric hum of liberation as the federal agents filed out with boxes of seized records, laptops, and folders clutched in their arms. The echoes of handcuffs snapping shut on corrupt board members still ringing in the air. And while Evelyn Parker sat slumped in a chair, her once imperious posture shattered into defeat, the neighbors who had once cowered before her began to gather around Marcus, their voices trembling with gratitude and disbelief, some clasping his hands, others whispering, "Thank you for standing up," as if you were a shield they had prayed for but never dared imagine. Marcus, steady as ever, simply nodded, reminding them that this was not about him alone, but about everyone who had endured years of manipulation and abuse, and his words, calm, deliberate, carried more weight than any speech Evelyn had ever barked. When people abuse power, they count on our silence. Today, silence ended. That night, news spread quickly, not just across the neighborhood, but into the wider town and beyond. The story of a black man whose cabin had been demolished over fabricated fees, only for the HOA to discover too late that his family were federal agents. A story so compelling that local reporters flocked to capture it. Their headlines blazed with phrases like HOA corruption exposed injustice at Lake Pinecrest. And as the narrative unfolded on screens and papers, residents from other HOA governed communities reached out, emboldened by Marcus's fight, realizing that tyranny hidden under the guise of rules could be challenged, dismantled, defeated. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn and her board members faced charges of fraud, extortion, and unlawful destruction of property, their names dragged into courtrooms instead of neighborhood newsletters, their assets frozen, their reputations obliterated. And while Evelyn once believed she could bend law to her will, she now stood before judges and prosecutors who saw her not as a queen of community order, but as a criminal who had preyed on her own neighbors. Marcus, meanwhile, was awarded full restitution, a formal public apology from the HOA, and most importantly, the legal return of his family's land, the ground on which his cabin once stood. And though the sight of rubble had broken his heart, the outpouring of community support and the unity of his family gave him strength to dream again. On a crisp autumn morning, construction trucks, this time hired by friends, volunteers, and neighbors who wanted to help, rolled onto his land, not to destroy but to rebuild, and day by day, the little red cabin began to rise from the ashes, beams lifted high, walls hammered into place, laughter ringing out as children painted signs. "Welcome home, Hill family," on scraps of wood, and when the final nail was driven, the cabin stood taller, stronger, brighter than before, a monument not just to Marcus's father's legacy, but to resilience, to justice, to the power of refusing to be silenced. On the porch, Marcus sat one evening with his nieces and nephews, fishing poles leaning against a railing, the soft glow of lanterns flickering as the lake mirrored the stars above. And when one of the children asked, "Uncle Marcus, why did they do it?" "Because some people mistake power for right," he replied after a brief pause while gazing out over the water. "But real power isn't in tearing down. It's in building up, in protecting what matters, in standing together." The children nodded, their young faces reflecting both innocence and newfound understanding. And as laughter once again filled the air, Marcus knew the cabin was more than wood and nails. It was proof that cruelty can destroy walls but never spirit, that injustice can wound but never erase truth, and that family, united by love and law, can rebuild stronger than any storm. And so the narrator's voice closes with a reflection that lingers like an echo in heart. those who wield authority. Unjustly may rise for a season, but when truth arrives, steady, patient, unstoppable, their kingdoms fall, and what remains is not their fear, but a legacy of those who endured, who fought, and who showed the world that silence is never the final word.